All right, so I've got these shapes in here, and as I keep blocking them in, it's covering up what I want, and so I can keep building shapes, some of them hard-edged, some of them rounded, and use Command T, kind of stretch them. But then every once in a while, I'm going to need to manipulate that shape more than just rotating and just stretching. So that's when I'll right-click inside the transform box, and I'll get some other options that are really helpful for this. One of them is Skew, and Skew is a good option for this because I can just take one anchor point and drag it out. Right? And if I want even more freedom, I can do Distort, because Skew locks it to an axis. Distort does not lock it to an axis, so it's great for kind of perspective. And I can kind of fill in these shapes a little bit better. But notice here, this is only a 4-cornered shape, so there's no way I can get it to match both of those. So I need to do another shape maybe. Or I can try this new tool, which I really like, called Warp. What Warp does is it splits your shape or selection, any selection, into a 9-segment kind of chicken wire mesh. And then it allows you to tug at different parts of the mesh. And that way I can get not more corners, but I can get more dynamics out of the shape. So it's sharp edge there, but rounded here. And that's the challenge of this, being limited by the shape tools and by the transform functions. Can you get those shapes to work? Now, it can be hard to warp really boring shapes into something really complicated. So then the last thing I'll show you is the custom shape tool at the bottom of the shape options. And the custom shapes, there are a lot of them. They're all these kind of clip art shapes. And they're almost embarrassingly like scrapbooky. But there's one that's really useful. The others just get like overused. But it's this one, which looks like kind of a cloudy, lumpy star. So that's usually the custom shape I'll use. And I can turn it into almost anything. So for instance, this thing, I draw my custom shape tool, and then I immediately transform it, Command T, and I immediately warp it. And I can start tugging it and pushing it in different directions. And that can be really effective. Okay, but I'm getting to a problem. I have all these different shape layers now. If I turn off my reference layer, that's what it looks like. You'll notice whatever layer you're selected on, it will give you a faint outline just to show you what the shape is. But when you go to another layer, that outline will disappear. So these are really like cutouts. There's no line around them unless we change the properties to give them an outline, which is called a stroke. But I'm not quite there yet. But I've covered up so much of my image, I know there's a dark oval or something in there, but I have to kind of guess where it is at this point because it's covered up, right? And I can change the color by double-clicking and selecting. But it might not be in the right place, so I don't know how to edit it. So now what I'm going to do is click on my reference image, and I'm going to make a duplicate of it. And that's different than copy and paste. So let me show you the difference. If I copy and paste, that means I first have to select all of it. So select all or Command A. I have to then go to Edit Copy or Command C. And then I have to do Edit Paste, Command V. And it creates a copy of the layer. And it's not helping my point because it didn't do what I wanted it to do. But usually in Photoshop, when you copy and paste, it will offset the image a little bit. It will move it a little bit so you know that you have a copy. We don't want the image to move at all. So instead, we're going to duplicate. And you can go to Layer, Duplicate Layer, but then you have to name it, all this stuff. So the shortcut for that is just Command-J. And I use Command-J constantly. So it duplicates a selection or a whole layer if you select the layer and just makes an exact copy of it above it. So Command-J, now I have 2 reference layers. I'm going to move it to the very top of my layers, but now I have a lot of layers. So if I click and drag, it's kind of a burden. So the shortcut for moving something up through the layers is Command right bracket. And then you can move it up through the layers, layer by layer. And it looks kind of cool. Ooh. And we want it on the very top. So I just keep going until I can't go anymore. Then I'm going to take its opacity way down to like 20%. Now, this is a good solution because it makes it look like all of my shapes are transparent, but my shapes aren't transparent. And my shapes are still the color they're supposed to be. And yet, it shows me all the things that are going on behind the shapes. But instead of going on behind, they're going on above, and we're seeing through them. The other thing I want to do is I want to lock that layer to make sure I don't accidentally move it or do something weird with it. And now I can just keep building shapes. And I can edit existing shapes. So I can go back to this ellipse now, and I can say warp. And I can tug it down at the top here. And make it more like that dark shape it's supposed to reference. And if I need to do it again, I can keep doing it again. So unlike the pixel image that we loaded originally, as you change your shapes, they will perfectly be smooth. As you make them bigger, they'll still perfectly be smooth because they are vectors, not locked grids of pixels. But Photoshop is dominantly a pixel-based program, so at the end of the day, it's going to be one set of pixels. But while we're working, it will always look as good as it possibly can within those pixels, as long as we don't rasterize our shape layers, and we keep them as shapes. So there's a lot we can play with. I don't want you to get too picky. We're going from general to specific as we go. But now I can use the warp tool and refine even my big shapes to be a little bit more descriptive of what's actually there. And this project helps us see that work that we like, two-dimensional work that we like, has more to do with just how things are arranged in a space and the shapes they take up than with the fine detail or the individual technique. And I'm sure you've experienced that in your own work. You might put a lot of effort and work into something, but it just never seems to be very satisfying. Like the piece just isn't working out. And that's just because the compositional shape is flawed. Can't really get over that. So that's where we're always going to pay attention originally. It's just the simple shapes. All right, I'm going to use a custom shape here. Darker color. And you see it's between layers. So once you have enough, you can start playing with the overlap of layers as well. And the trick to this assignment is not doing more work than you have to. Don't get caught up in tiny details when simpler shapes will do the job for you. Don't worry about a ton of color variations when one general color will do a lot for you. And I always, when I'm doing the warp tool, I always am thinking about rolling out dough. And it can be kind of a strange experience, but to get the shapes you want, you always have to kind of go out from the center. You often have to make it bigger than you want in order to get the shape you want, and then kind of roll it back. And at any time, you can just turn off your background and kind of see what your shapes are doing on their own. See what shapes are needed. You can also just copy and paste or duplicate from shape layers you've already created. So I just created this leg. I can just Command J, duplicate that, and have a copy that I can use for this foot over here, at least as a start for it, and then warp from that. Trying to take all the advantages of digital. And then the greatest advantage of these vector tools is they take up almost no memory. So it doesn't slow processing down at all to use so many individual shapes. And this is kind of a fun, like,